For those who don't know, my name is Dr. Jennifer Chu, and I'm the Global Director for Menicon Specialty Lens Division. And it is always an honor and privilege to be here with you today to host the webinar with Paul. So thank you all for being here. On behalf of Menicon, once again, we appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day to join us and to learn about how to fit Rose K optimally. So we hope today's session will be very helpful and interesting for you. Now, about today's session, it will be special. So for those who have attended our sessions in the past, you'll know we usually do a lecture and then a question and answer session afterwards. It will be a little different today. We decided because 2020 has been such a different and challenging year for many, but also just a very unique year, we decided to have our final webinar be unique as well. So we decided to structure it in a question and answer fashion. So we're going to do this Rose K style. And so what we've done is we've selected some of the most common questions that we've received over this last year. So either questions that we've received from you guys during our webinars or during email consultations that you guys send through. So Paul and I have gone through and we've selected some of the more interesting questions and some of the more important questions that we believe would be very helpful to address for a wider audience. So with a question and answer session about Rose K, what better person to actually answer these questions than the inventor himself, Paul Rose. So Paul is joining us today from New Zealand. Paul, how are you doing today, my friend?
Yes, I'm doing fine, thank you. Lovely day here. It's not a crazy time at night like it is in Chile at the moment.
Yes, so Paul's coming from New Zealand. I am coming to you from Vancouver, Canada. And behind the scenes, which I hope she'll pop up her video, is Dr. Patricia Flores. For those who've joined our webinars in the past, you'll know that Dr. Flores is the glue that keeps us together. So she will be running the webinar out of Santiago, Chile. Hello, Dr. Flores. How are you this very, very early part of the morning or late night for you?
Yes, it's very early, but everything is okay.
Perfect. Well, thank you for making sure everything runs smoothly.
Welcome.
All right, guys. Now, a few housekeeping notes before we get completely started. As with our other webinars, we will mute everybody. This is just to help us avoid any extra distractions from extra sounds because we do have a few hundred people that are attending today. So welcome. And like I said, unfortunately, we have to mute you all. That being said, even though you're muted, as always, we always encourage questions. So if during this question and answer session, a question pops in your mind related to the topic that we are talking about, please feel free to send us that question. So in your GoToWebinar control panel, there is a questions tab. Click on the questions tab, type your question into us. It might look like one of these versions that you have, depending on which app you're using, but send us your question. Dr. Flores will filter the questions, and if they are directly related to the topic that we are talking about, she will ask that question at the end of each section that we'll have, and I'll talk about that in a second. If you have a question that pops in your mind that is not directly related to the topic, please feel free to send those questions as well. We'd be happy to answer those questions and post those on our website afterwards. And who knows, we may use those questions in the future for another session. So again, please feel free to send us all the questions that you've got. In addition to that, as many of you know, in the GoToWebinar control panel, there's also a handout section. Dr. Flores has uploaded our Rose K2, our Excel fitting guide, as well as the special options guide. So we have 3 guides there for you to download and use as your reference as we go along. Okay, guys, so enough of that. Let's get to the meat of it. So this session, as we said, is called Unwrapping the Mysteries of Rose K. And I will moderate the session and ask Paul some questions. As I mentioned, we as a team have picked these questions out of a multitude of questions we've received. Because we have known the answers ahead of time, Paul has very kindly put together a few slides to help answer some of these questions. Part of the reason we've done that is that we do recognize we've got people attending from all different corners of the world, and hopefully having a visual will help you to understand the answer that Paul is giving and give you a chance to see a visual representation of the answer that he will give rather than just giving an answer verbally. So in some of the slides, you'll see a follow-up answer slide that will go along with it, but Paul will give you his verbal answer as well. So without further ado, Paul and Patricia. Paul, are you ready for this, my friend?
Absolutely, Jennifer.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, with the huge amount of questions that we get every year, we can actually categorize those questions into different topics or categories. And these are the 4 key categories that we will touch on today. So the first one's with regards to general questions about Rose K designs. We'll talk then, look at questions related to fitting of Rose K lenses. Then we'll address questions around the topics of ordering lenses and patient aftercare. And then the final category we'll touch on is the care of Rose K lenses, because we do get a lot of questions asking for advice on what to do. So it will be a variety of topics, and after each different category, I will ask Dr. Flores to let us know if there are any questions that come in. So again, send us your questions as we go along. So let's go ahead and get started. So our first category are Rose K designs. First question, Paul. All right. So we know that people fit a whole bunch of different designs out there. But a lot of people have actually wondered exactly how many Rose K designs are available, Paul. So we do have a slide for that, but I'll let you speak to that, Paul.
So Jennifer, there are 6 different designs. My first design, which I did in 1990, was released on the market in New Zealand, was for oval cones because they're very, very common in New Zealand. So I had a huge database of patients that I could use for research. I thought in my ignorance that that would be the last design, but I soon in fact found out that I had to come up with further designs for different types of irregular cornea. And you can see in that slide as we go through. In 2000 I did a post-surgical slide, a design. Then in the IC design in 2005, nipple cones only for a very small number of cases, represents less than 5% of cones, so it was a very small market. And then the semi-sclerals became very popular, so I did my corneal scleral XL in 2013, and finally my Rose K Soft in 2016. And they all have slightly different applications for different conditions.
Great. So then, Paul, just as a personal question, which design for you was the most difficult to actually create or design?
Interesting question, Jennifer. You said you're going to throw in a few girly ones.
Hey.
The nipple cone was the most difficult. It's got the most curves in of all the lenses. It's got about 8 different curves to get exactly the shape I wanted into the back surface of the lens. So actually the nipple cone was the most time-consuming lens for me.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Paul. So for those who are wondering, because we know many of you sometimes have your favorite Rose K design, please be aware that there are 6 total designs that will address different parts or different types of irregular cornea. So thank you for that, Paul. All right, next question. So this is one that we get in some markets. So as you had mentioned, Paul, there is a Rose K1 and also a Rose K2. And in some markets where we have Rose K1, we do get this question: can I fit a Rose K2 lens from a Rose K1 trial set? And what is the difference between Rose K1 and Rose K2? So, Paul.
So Jennifer, the answer is yes, you can. When I went from Rose K1 to Rose K2, I had to take that into account because there was probably around 10,000 trial sets, Rose K1 trial sets in the market. And I can just imagine the lab saying to me, well, Paul, we're going to have to throw those away and you're all going to have to go to Rose K2. So I made sure that both sets had identical sagittal heights and axial edge lifts. To do that, I had to tweak the design a little bit when I went to Rose K2. And you just bring up that next picture, Jennifer, to explain the difference between them. You can see here on the left, the first design, Rose K1, had a spherical both front optic and back optic. So those two surfaces were often not quite parallel, particularly in high minus powers, and that gave rise to a lot of spherical aberration. So you had multiple focuses falling around the retina. When I went to Rose K2, I incorporated a slightly larger aspheric back optic zone and also used aberration control curves on the front of the lens to get rid of any residual spherical aberration that was still left that wasn't neutralized by the aspheric value that I'd put on the back. And what did that do? Particularly for powers over -10, and we did a study on it, it made a huge difference to the acuity these people got, particularly in the distance. So you can see in that right picture there, those focal points come all onto the retina, not just some of them.
Great. Now, Paul, is there any situation where you would choose Rose K1 instead of Rose K2?
Another good question, Jennifer. There is in a trial I did on 100 patients where I compared Rose K1 and Rose K2, there was one patient that preferred Rose K1, one patient. So it's not many patients. And this was a patient that had quite a low oval cone. And I suspect if Rose K2 decenters too much, it actually causes problems with the aberration curves on the front. And therefore you can sometimes get poorer vision. So if you're just not getting the vision you want, particularly in lower minus powers, then Rose K1 is still used in some markets, but it has been mainly phased out by Rose K2.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul. All right, next question. This is a common one that we get. What is the difference in design between Rose K2 PG and Rose K2 IC?
Okay, they are both very similar designs. They are larger optic zones than the keratoconic designs, back optic zones, and they don't have as much flattening in the periphery. They have reverse geometry and base curves flatter than 7.4. So what does that mean? We're trying to fit those oblate corneas, and that amount of reverse geometry gets greater and greater as the base curve gets flatter. And my whole reasoning was, if you've got a base curve of 9, you've obviously got an odd-shaped cornea. You need to have reverse geometry to be able to fit it correctly. So when I created Rose K2 IC, the reason I did it, because if you try to use a diameter, and the diameter of 10.4 for the Postgraph lens is ideal for grafts, post-grafts. It just fits outside the graft, gives stability, and I experimented with diameters and found that 10.4 was ideal. But where you required larger lenses, like in those days, pellucid, we didn't use semi-scleral lenses, we used corneal lenses. It was very hard to get even a diameter of 10.4 good on these very large areas of corneal distortion. So I decided then to create another design which had a slightly larger back optic, a little bit less axial edge lift, and the standard diameter was either 11.2 or 11.4 depending on the market. Because if you take a 10.4 lens and you want to extrapolate the diameter up to, say, 11.6, very hard to work out what's going to happen, how that lens is going to fit. It's much, much better to have a trial lens as close as possible to the lens that you actually order. So most practitioners won't extrapolate more than 0.5 millimeter away from the diameter of the trial lens they're fitting. So it was created so that you had trial lenses as close as possible to the final lens. So the post-graft lens, specifically for grafts, that should be your first option. But if you've got these larger areas of distortion, or you can't get good location or comfort with the post-graft lens, you can then go to the IC lens, a bigger lens, and sometimes it fixes up the problem.
Okay. Paul, just off the top of your head, do you recall which design is used more often, PG or IC?
Depends on the market, Jennifer. It was amazing. America was, before semi-scleral lenses came in, was very much into large corneal lenses. And when I created that design, it was to meet the market at that time. They were using much larger diameters than was being used in the rest of the world. The Postgraph lens probably is more commonly used, although I know in looking at the stats that they are both about the same percentage of a regular cornea sales, about 10% of both, Jennifer. So fairly similar, but it does depend on the market.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we have a ton of questions to get through. So those were just some basic questions with regards to the design. Dr. Flores, are you there, my friend?
I am here.
Perfect. Do we have any extra questions that have come up at all?
Yes, from John.
Okay.
He asked about, will you ever make a rose K scleral, Paul?
Gosh, Patricia, I've been asked that question many times in my life because it's not a difficult design to create. It's a very simple design, much more simple than the corneal lenses, in my opinion. I would find it very hard to go out and talk about the advantages of a corneal scleral lens, which is what XL is, and then offer, on the other hand, a scleral lens, because for me, there is many advantages of corneal sclerals over sclerals. And just to list one or two, settling time is a fraction of scleral lenses. More tear exchange, some movement, more oxygen to the cornea, less midday fogging. I could go on. In fact, I've got a lecture on that. So I believe corneal sclerals are much better long term for the cornea than full sclerals, which basically seal off and you get very little tear exchange. So my answer, Patricia, a very long one, the answer is no.
Okay, perfect.
Just one follow-up on that, Paul. It just dawned on me. What unites the Rose K family is the fitting system. So the fitting steps, the 5-step fitting system, very simple, easy to do. You seem quite confident that you could design a scleral lens for Rose K. Would that scleral lens follow those same 5 steps if you were to design one? Is that possible?
I'd have to give that some thought, Jennifer, because fitting scleral lenses is done on different principles, and I suspect the 5-step fitting system wouldn't easily fit in to the way that scleral lenses are fitted with sagittal heights, and they don't really look at fluorescent pattern. Where with my corneal scleral lenses, you're still making judgment on fluorescent pattern, so probably wouldn't fit into the 5-step fitting system very well.
Okay, great. All right, that wraps up the design session or section. So thank you. I guess it was John that asked that question. Let's move on to fitting questions now. So we get a ton of these every year with regards to how to handle certain things with regards to fits. So Paul, first question in this session. Why do you choose the minimum diameter for Rose K2? Because one of the steps is to check the diameter, and you want it. We tell everybody to choose the minimum diameter that gives you comfort and centration and everything. So why do you choose the minimum diameter?
So often, irregular corneas have different sagittal heights and different meridians, Jennifer. So what happens is, as you go out, the sagittal height, say at 180 versus 90, gets greater and greater. If you look at the bottom diagram there, that white circle, if we could make a lens that small, and in fact, we used to do that when we couldn't make toric corneal lenses way back in the 60s and 70s. If you could make a lens that small, the sagittal heights difference at 90 and at 0 or 180 is not something you'd have to be concerned about. So this is a case of with the rule of astigmatism, it's flatter in the horizontal meridian. But the time you get out to the pink arrows, out to the edge of the lens, then you start to see significant changes in the edge lift pattern, very tight at 180 and very loose or open at 90. Now just imagine extending that out further beyond the limbus, another 50% of that diameter. And if that, with the rule of astigmatism, continues out onto the sclera, your sagittal heights in the 2 meridians are going to be greater and greater. So the bigger your corneal lens, or the bigger you go to a XL lens, the more you have to consider all different meridians to get actually fitting correctly. So why I say keep it to the minimum, it just minimizes the need to use more complex asymmetric options. So we also know from studies that the sclera is more symmetrical out to about 15 millimeters. So that was another reason I kept my diameter in XL below 15 millimeters.
Yeah, so I guess that's why, Paul, we see people use a lot of asymmetric options with the XL design compared to the others, I guess.
Yes, you're going to definitely need more asymmetrics for that design, Jennifer.
Okay, great. Next question then. So these are all fitting questions, remember. So if I decide to make a change in the base curve of a Rose K2 corneal lens, how does this change the peripheral fit?
Basically, the flatter you go, the more the edge lift opens up. And this slide shows it beautifully. So here is a picture of Rose K lenses, all with a standard lift. That's important to note. So all these have a 0 or standard lift on the same eye. Just look at what happens to the edge lift as we change the base curve. The steepest one is 7.0, has the narrowest band at the edge. The flattest one, 7.5, in the bottom right-hand corner, has the widest lift. So as you change the base curve, the flatter you go, the more edge lift you create. If you just, you can see there, so in the top left, there's insufficient edge lift. In the bottom right, there is excessive edge lift. Well, it also brings up the importance of always getting your base curve correct before you judge your edge lift, because if you don't, you will judge the edge lift incorrectly. So always get your first step, get the base curve correct, that minimum very feather touch with corneal lenses before you decide what you're going to do with your edge lift.
Perfect. I guess that's why we always advocate follow the fitting steps and follow the guide.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Now then conversely, Paul, so if I decide to change the peripheral edge lift, for example, increasing it by +1 in a corneal lens, how does this affect the central fitting?
Well, if you actually thought about it, Jennifer, when you change the edge lift, this is going to change all curves outside the back optic zone of my designs. They get flatter. Let's say in this case, they would get flatter. That would drop your sagittal height of the lens. So if we didn't make some change to what was happening, when you got the lens back with the increased lift, it would actually fit flat centrally. So I decided that I didn't want practitioners to have to actually consider that and make adjustments to the base curve when they were ordering different lifts. So I automatically built into the program that cuts the lens a compensation, so that when you actually cut a lift other than a standard lift, it will make a compensation to the base curve and to the power. So if we can show that effectively with that diagram. So if this is a lens with a standard lift, you can see it's bearing on the cornea just before the lift starts off, and we go to an increased lift, the lens would actually sit down quite considerably on the cornea. So we have to then increase the sagittal height somehow to make it like the trial lens. So it will not affect at all, when you change the lift, it won't affect the central fit. The only thing that will change is the peripheral fit.
Yeah. And that's all because everything is automatically calculated.
Automatically calculated in the program that cuts the lenses.
Perfect. So the theory for fitting lenses is still there. It's just you've taken the work out of it for our practitioners to do. So they don't need to make any calculations themselves.
If we have a look at an example there, Jennifer, I think it might be on that next slide. Oh, no, it's a bit further on, okay?
Yeah.
You can go on to the next one, that's fine.
Okay. So thank you for that, Paul. That is a common question we get because a lot of practitioners want to know, do I need to make other changes? So in Rose K case, no, because Paul has done it for you.
It does bring up one question, which this next question answers. So if you said, if you change the edge lift value, Jennifer,
yep.
what
adjustments are made to the base curve and power? So not just the, so I guess that answers the question, Paul. So if we change the edge lift value, what adjustments are made to the base curve and the power of the final lens that's received?
Okay, so if we can take a sample of that, let's just use the most common one where you increase the edge lift by a standard increased lift, which is +1. So if I increase the lift, I'm going to reduce the sagittal height of the lens. So I have to steepen the base curve to increase the sagittal height back to the original lens. But when I steepen the base curve, I effectively make the eye more myopic. And therefore, I also have to increase the power to have it have the same effective power on the cornea. So Jennifer, we take the example of a standard increased lift. You would receive a lens back that was 0.05 steeper if you ordered the increased lift than you ordered, and the power would be minus 0.50 stronger. So if we take another example there, for example, a trial lens of 7.0 minus 6 with a standard lift, however, if it wants an increased lift, the lab will supply with you a 6.95 base curve with a 650 power. But if you can pick there again, Jennifer, that lens will have exactly the same central fit and effective power on the eye. The peripheral fit is the only parameter which will change.
That's good to know, Paul, because a lot of times when practitioners get their lenses, they're a bit alarmed that the base curve is different than what they had ordered.
I can understand that, and the power may be different as well.
Yeah.
The proof is in the putting it on the eye, and when they put it on the eye, they'll find, oh, it fits the same. And gosh, no, the power was stronger, but it's perfect. So not an issue.
Okay. So there you go, guys, because we get a lot of questions is why is my power and my base curve different than what I ordered? It's because the system actually calculates what it should be in order to get you the fit that you're really wanting. So thank you for clarifying that, Paul.
Not at all.
Okay, so this is a common one that we get. Believe it or not, out of all the conditions, we get a lot of questions about grafts. So common question is, what is the best design for post-graft corneas? And I assume, Paul, that people ask this question all the time because these corneas tend to be more fragile. So what is the best design for post-graft corneas according to Paul Rose?
A corneal lens, if you can get stability and comfort. And that's a short answer. For me, Jennifer, if I can get stability and comfort and the patient's happy with good vision, I will use a corneal lens. We know that these have been used for years. They're very much easier on grafts than I think larger lenses. So the post-graft rose design, if you can get it to work, I would still try it first.
Okay. Then on that note then, Paul, so should we always try the corneal lens on a graft before going to a larger design like a semiscleral?
There are many reasons which you may consider, Jennifer. You might have to look at it and say, well, how's the endothelium condition? Is it an old graft? Is it rigid? Can I actually get a corneal lens to stay on there? So there's no easy answer, but would I try a corneal lens first? Absolutely, I would try to get. We know that these lenses are easy on the cornea. They don't affect, with modern gas permeable materials, we don't affect the endothelium. If you think about the endothelium, we are born with about 5,000 cells, endothelial cells, per square millimeter. But by age of around 40, that has actually dropped to down around 3,000. And that continues all our years. So if the graft is old, then you have to consider, is the endothelium a condition that can take any lowered oxygen at all? If you look at full thickness grafts, fortunately these days there's not so many, but there's a lot of them still around out there. 10 days post-surgery in this study, the cell density was 2,400. But after 5 years, there was a 56% loss, and we'd reduced it down to close to 1,000. Now, once you get down below 1,000, can you actually start keeping that cornea clear still, or are you going to cause problems of oxygen? Because you get further endothelial cell loss as we get older, as that eye gets older, and this is the data on endothelial cell loss over 3 to 5 years and then 5 to 10 years. So you've just got to be very careful. You can't just say, oh, I've got a odd-shaped cornea here, I'm just going to dump a scleral lens onto it. I think I have seen in my life 2 grafts that were absolutely killed by scleral lenses with huge vessel growth. And if you're going to fit scleral lenses, then my big advice is to monitor them very, very closely, because you can do damage. And please look at the endothelium. If you can't measure how many cells you have a square millimeter, at least have a look to see what it looks like. Whether you have a lot of polymorphism or you have a reasonable density, and keep an eye on them.
Great. Now you answered my question, because I was going to ask you if you had ever experienced or seen a case where the endothelium was so poor that you would not recommend a lens. So it sounds like you have seen a couple cases.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Once you get down, Jennifer, in the range of below 700, you really are pushed getting enough endothelial pump to keep that cornea clear.
Okay. Yeah, I guess the rule number one is do no harm, right, guys? So
Yeah.
always check. And then just to wrap this question up then, Paul, so with regards to Postgraph corneas, from a Rose K lens selection perspective, if you're saying go corneal first, would your first choice still be, I guess, the PG lens, and then IC, and then XL then, in that order?
That's exactly right, Jennifer. I would see if I could get it stable and a good, comfortable fit with either PG first, then with IC. If that didn't work, then yes, I would go to XL. And I'd always use a corneal scleral lens rather than a scleral lens on a graft. And there's quite a few fitters around the world. And I went to a lecture this last year where a fitter said they would not use a scleral lens on a graft under any conditions. I think corneal scleral lenses at least give you some airflow and more oxygen. I think they're safer for grafts.
Okay, good. Thank you, Paul. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. Cross-linking. We do get a lot of questions about cross-linking. So first question, Paul. So for those oval cones that have undergone cross-linking, would you still select a Rose K keratoconic lens for an oval cone after cross-linking?
Yes, absolutely, Jennifer. There's with cross-linking, you don't get a huge, we think about, wow, how much change do we get? But we only actually get, on the average, about 1.75 diopters. And that maximum change usually has occurred by 18 months. So in the first 3 months, you get your main change, and then you get smaller changes as we get a further year down the track. So what does that actually represent? 1.75 diopters is not much on a 60 diopter cornea. And what does it represent in millimeters? It's about 0.2 of a millimeter. So if the lens that you wore before cross-linking is slightly steep after cross-linking, in many cases it doesn't matter at all. And often before cross-linking, the lens has been slightly flat anyway. So you end up, I've seen cases where after cross-linking, yes, you're slightly flatter cornea, you end up with a perfect fitting lens. And several practitioners have told me they've used the same lens after cross-linking that they used before.
Okay. And do you notice a difference at all between epi on and epi off?
No, Jennifer, I can honestly say I have not noticed a difference between the two.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So we can still fit these lenses after cross-linking, guys. All right. Next question has to do with equipment. So we know a ton of practitioners out there now have access to some pretty tremendous instruments out there to measure different parts of the cornea. One of those is OCT. So we do get questions because people tend to use that to fit scleral lenses. Can you use, Paul, OCT to help with Rose K fitting? And if you can, how many microns would you be looking for in each area under a lens?
It depends on the design, Jennifer. So let's first talk about the corneal lens designs, which you've put up there. For me, it's a waste of time using an OCT on a corneal lens fitting. You get a very accurate fluorescent pattern with a Burton lamp or a slit lamp, and a very good assessment of what's happening on the overall fit. So very time consuming, and with OCTs, you only are measuring along that line where you actually place the OCT arrows. Mm-hmm. So I don't ever use it for corneal fits. However, for XL, I do use it to verify my final lens. So as you know that for XL fittings, you're looking at the highest point on the cornea, and that for grafts, for example, is not going to be centrally, it's going to be along the edge of the graft host interface. So you would look there and with the fluorescent initially, fit it, and then when I think I'm right, I will use an OCT just to verify my edge lift in the 4 quadrants, and also that highest point. I don't worry about what's happening centrally because with my fitting guide, it doesn't matter what's happening centrally in those situations. So I aim for sort of 35 to 450 microns clearance over that highest point on the cornea, and a little bit more out from the edge lift, a little bit more, about 60 to 70 microns.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Paul. So if you guys have an OCT out there, you can use it to help fit, at least with the larger diameter lens with our XL. Okay. This question, we decided to include this question because it comes up at almost every webinar we do. So to increase the movement, Paul, in corneal lenses, we flatten the base curve, but in XL, we steepen the base curve. Why?
Okay, this is my theory, Jennifer. I can't say I've ever proved it, but if you take two flat pieces of glass, put water between them, and then force them so they have a very, very thin layer of water between them, you can't physically pull those two pieces apart. All you can do is slide them apart. So I think if you actually fit a lens flat, you then tend to line the front of the cornea with the back of the lens surface more accurately. So if you fit it steep, you misalign those two surfaces. So you create more capillary force the more parallel you are over the surface area of the cornea. So the flatter you go, the better alignment you get. And I think that just reduces the movement. That's my theory anyway.
Okay, so like Paul said, he qualified that. This has not been proven. So if there's anybody out there who is interested in doing a master's or PhD thesis, please, this is the topic you could potentially go for. So that is Paul's theory, and that's the one he's sticking with now until I guess Paul someone proves it otherwise. All right, thanks for that, Paul. Next question. What is the clearance over the limbal zone with a Rose K2 XL on eye or in situ?
Okay, Jennifer, it's around 10 to 20 microns, and you need at least 30 microns to get fluorescence. So that will often appear as touch. But if you look at the picture on the right-hand side there, you can see where the limbus is, and you can see the clearance over that. It's very minimal. It's only probably 10 to 20 microns through that area. So you can see that where the lens lands inside the limbus, and then it starts scooting off just inside the limbus where that vertical black line is and moves out to the edge of the lens. So it may appear as touch, but it's around 10 to 20 microns. People said to me, aren't you concerned about landing the lens close to the limbus? And I can honestly say initially I was, but we've now had thousands of XL fits over 5 years without any reports of damaging limbal cells, stem cells, or any other problems, Jennifer. So for me, with a corneal scleral lens, you get much more tear exchange up to the limbus, which I think is more important than sealing off the whole area. I think puts your limbal stem cells more at risk than a corneal scleral fit.
Yeah, it's certainly a very different philosophy to scleral lenses that try and vault that entire area. So, okay. We made it, Paul. So that was one of our longer sessions. Dr. Flores, are you still there, my friend?
I am here.
Do we have any questions at all?
Don't
or any of the previous stuff?
Don't have questions from the audience, but I have a personal question. Is the amount of the limbal clearance the same for all base curve, Paul?
Yes, the design does do that. There is no difference, no matter what base curve you're fitting. The only way you can change that limbal clearance in my design is to change the edge lift, Patricia. It's not something you can change independently of anything else. So it's only the only edge lifts is you'd have to change it to change that clearance at the limbus.
Okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
Good. Okay, so the next topic that we'll cover is just with regards to ordering and patient aftercare. So first question, Paul. can I get all lenses and lens options from my local lab or distributor? Paul.
The answer is you can order them from your local distributor, but some laboratories, and there's 22 laboratories that make rose-K lenses around the world, not all of them can make the very complicated asymmetric options. So we have labs like Menicon UK that can make all the designs. In America, they can make all the designs. But so in some cases, with complicated XL designs particularly, they have to order those off other labs. But certainly any distributor or lab can take your order.
Yeah. So as just speaking on behalf of Menicon, we try and make sure that whatever design or option that you need, if your local lab or distributor cannot provide it to you, the labs and distributors are wonderful at contacting us. And I call this, honestly, we are the rose-K family of fitters, but we have a rose-K family of manufacturers. And those are the manufacturers that you see on the screen. And chances are you guys are receiving lenses from one of them. And I guarantee you that if one of them cannot make one of the lenses, we very much are like a family. We will find one of the other groups that can make the lens for them. So don't worry if you think your design's super complicated and it's too complicated for your lab. Don't worry, as I said, because we can get another lab to help make them. So yes, okay. Next question. With regards to special options, Paul, the question we tend to get is people just want some clarification on how do you actually order special options? Like what do you need to specify so that the lab knows what you're trying to order?
Different labs do slightly different things, Jennifer, but let's just identify first what are those options. So if we take this schematic diagram, the blue dot represents the limbuses for XL, and the black is the edge of the lens. So if you're ordering a quadrant specific edge lift, yes, you can bring that up. What changes is anything outside that red circle, but anything inside that red circle stays the same. So basically your fit over the cornea doesn't change at all. Let's go to the next one, which is the toric periphery. If you order a toric periphery, you change the fit outside that blue back optic zone. So it does affect the fit both on the peripheral cornea and out to the edge of the lens. And finally, ACT, or asymmetric technology, it actually affects 180 degrees. So you can see it starts, if we had ACT, down at 270, as this diagram shows. You start the steepening just below the horizontal, and it continues to steepen down to the very steepest point at 6 o'clock there. So it depends on the design. Let's just go through each design. So firstly, quadrant specific edge lift. Here's a case where you say, okay, I want to increase the edge lift in just one quadrant here. So you identify the quadrant and the axis that you want to do it, and the way that you would order it is with the lab. If you bring that up, thanks, Jennifer. So the example here, you would ask for a base curve of 7.2, a -3 or 14.6, and you specify the quadrant that you want it in. Some laboratories prefer you to specify the actual quadrant. You say it's 180 to 270. Others say, give me the central axis. Personally, I use the central axis position, and in this case, it's 225 degrees. We go to the next one, which is the toric periphery. You can see here, this is a typical width rule that's showing there, where the lens is steepened in the vertical and flattened in the horizontal position. So the standard toric periphery is 1.2. So if you decide on XL that you want a toric periphery, then they will give you a 1.2 toric toricity unless you specify otherwise. You can go from about 0.2 up to 2.0. So there's a big variety of amount of toricity that you require. So what does that mean? If you went with the standard 1.2 toricity, the lens would be steepened in the vertical by 0.6 and flattened in the horizontal by 0.6, giving you the 1.2 difference. But you can split the toricity unevenly. So you might say, I only want to put 0.4 a change steeper in the vertical, but I want to go to 0.8 change in the horizontal. So you have a great variety of ways that you can express it. So for order, you would order the base curve, the power, the amount of toricity that you required, and you don't need to state the axis. The lens will orientate itself around very nicely and line the flattest axis up with the flattest axis on the lens, unless you're putting some cylinder on the front. Then the laboratory will need to know that axis. So it is useful actually to record that axis. When you're putting the trial lens on, they have laser marks on. Please record the axis on your card. You may need it if you want to incorporate residual astigmatism on the front later.
Okay.
And finally, the ACT, as I mentioned before. So with ACT, we will affect the fit both out from the limbus and, as you can see here, on the cornea as well. So you're going to need to state the axis of the ACT, because you may not want it exactly at 270. Although most of the ACT is usually inferiorly, it may be a little bit round at, say, another axis, for example, at 290. And at 290, you don't want the prism there because the thing's going to turn around to the 270 position. So you would put the axis at 290 and you would put the prism at 270. But you don't need to state that unless the act axis is not at 270. The lab will assume it's at 270 and put the prism and the ACT in exactly the same place unless you state otherwise.
Okay. Great. Thank you for clarifying, Paul. I think that helps a lot of people with regards to ordering these options. I think just to err on the side of caution, I would probably write as much as I can or talk to the lab and find out what they're comfortable in trying, how they would interpret what you're trying to do. So if in doubt, just call your lab or your distributor if you need to clarify or you just want to be 100% sure that what you're asking for is what you're going to get. So, but thank you for clarifying that, Paul. Okay, now with regards to aftercare, what follow-up schedule do you recommend for Rose K lenses? So corneal lenses versus XL lenses.
Okay, slightly different for corneal lenses. Look at corneal lenses first. I like the first follow-up check at 2 weeks. I used to do it 1 week, and they were still so full of moans about comfort, I decided to give that away. And I found that at 2 weeks, things had settled down. I got more satisfaction. I started wearing time at 2 hours a day and increased by 1 hour a day. And I had them not go beyond 8 hours until I've seen them at that first 2 week check. If at that check everything looks good, I'm happy to take it up to 12 hours a day. They're often going to push it further. So they always say, how long can I wear these lenses? And that varies with each individual. So I always say up to 12 hours a day. You know they're going to go longer than that. So I don't want to recommend 16 hours a day because they'll go 18 hours a day. So I recommend up to 20 hours a day. So after that first 2 weeks, I see them at 1 month and then 6 months from thereafter. With XL, Jennifer, it's a little bit different. So same as corneal lenses at the first check, I see at 2 weeks, but I'm a little bit more careful, particularly with grafts. With grafts, I'd like to see them at 1 week just to make sure everything's fine. And I keep their wearing time down to 4 hours maximum until I'm absolutely sure that I'm not doing any damage to that graft. And it's ideal that the patient comes in wearing the lens. It's not much good they bring it in and say, well, I haven't put it in today yet. You're not going to really get a good picture of how that lens is fitting. So very important patients come in wearing their lenses for their checkups, if that's absolutely possible. And that applies to corneal lenses as well.
Yeah. Fair enough. And again, with those grafts, I guess we just want to be extra careful with those because those are very fragile.
Absolutely. Okay.
Now, I am very aware of time. This is a lot of fun, but I want to make sure we get through this whole section. So we'll just sort of skip the extra questions. I'm not sure, Patricia, if there are extra questions, but sorry, we're going to go ahead to care of Rose K lenses. So we do get a lot of questions with regards to how to care for these lenses. One common question we get is, what care solutions do you recommend, Paul, for Rose K lenses?
I mean, Menicon have some great care solutions amongst their range, Jennifer. So at Boston also have some good solutions, but Medicare, particularly New Zealand, is used extensively for storage of lenses. I still prefer to use a separate digital cleaner when the lens comes out to get rid of surface debris. And I personally don't find that the multi-purpose solutions are as effective as a cleaner. They claim they are, but I find that I prefer to use a separate cleaner like Low Bob or some alcohol-based cleaner to get rid of those deposits before it goes into your multi-purpose solution like Medicare Pure or Yeek pH to store the lens overnight. So I like to use a separate cleaner, a digital cleaner first.
Okay.
However, also I like to include Progent in the cleaning. Progent is a very strong cleaner that strips off any residual deposits on the lens. Even if you used it once a month, it'd be great. But if you want to keep it really clean, use it once a week. It's a great solution. And that's what I advocate with patients. For rose-case soft, hydrogen peroxide is by far your best storage solution. Multi-purpose solutions don't really keep the lenses in ideal condition.
Great. And like I said, I know this is Menicon sponsored. There are some wonderful solutions out there outside of Menicon. We just put these on there because we know these solutions really well. But it is very important to make sure you keep your lenses clean and clean them on a regular basis. Okay, Paul. Oh, this one popped in. So Progent in action, Paul. Still your favorite?
I love this slide, Jennifer, because it just shows you how deposited those lenses were before Progent and then what happens to them after using Progent. And it can strip it off very, very well. And another product which is very good, Jennifer, is Minilab. I think it's a slide.
I think we lost you, Paul. Are you there?
I'm there. Yeah, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, you were talking about Minilab for a second there and you cut out.
Could you just go to the next slide, Jennifer? Okay, so that's been taken up. But Minilab is a solution that practitioners can use to actually strip the protein off the lens in-house. It's not for patients. It's a very, very strong hypochlorite solution. So Minilab, if you want to do some in-house cleaning on rigid lenses, within 20 minutes, it brings them back like new. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. And Paul is still a consultant. He's not actually a Menicon employee, but he'll promote our stuff. But I agree. Progent is definitely one of my favorite products within our portfolio.
A great solution.
You haven't tried it, give it a shot because it'll get your lenses clean. Okay, so we've just got a couple more questions left. How often do you replace the Rose-K lenses, Paul?
If a patient wants to know how long the lenses will last, Jennifer, I say 2 years. So that's run of the mill. Some labs will say a year, but it depends a lot. There are some variables, like if the guy is a worker, has got rough hands, he's going to destroy the surface quicker than somebody who's a professional that's got soft hands. Also, how well they're cared for. Do they clean them properly? Do they use excessive force when they digitally rub the lens? There's many variables, because even though a lens can look good and can fit well, with digital cleaning and with cleaning over time, it destroys those very sensitive aberration curves that you see on the front of the lens. And once those are destroyed, your vision's not quite as good. So I recommend every 2 years. And saying that, I've got patients that have had lenses 10 years and don't want to change them, and they're very happy. And I've had patients that don't even ever get more than 6 months before they break it or lose it or do something. So it depends a lot on the patient and the care of the lens.
Yeah, so like you said, patient dependent. I know for me, I recommend more regular replacement just from a hygiene perspective and also because of the curves. So it's patient dependent, but it's up to you guys to use your judgment. Okay, next. Oh, sorry, Paul.
Just one thing with soft lenses is a little different, Jennifer. With Rose-K soft, I advocate replacing Rose-K soft lenses obviously more frequently, and it depends on which regime you're using, but at the maximum 6 months before you replace them.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so next question, Paul. What are the benefits of including a plasma treatment for a lens like Rose-K?
Plasma treatments are a hyper clean. They clean the front surface. Before we had it, Jennifer, you often got lenses, new lenses from a lab that just wouldn't wet, and you had to really use an alcohol-based cleaner to really try to get it. It's because of the residuals that were left in the manufacturing process. So plasma treatments strip all any residuals off. They also leave a very, very thin coat of plasma across the front of the lens, which helps the lens to wet and helps the comfort. Usually by 6 months it's gone, so it's really only initially. Most labs now around the world include it routinely on the materials. For example, Menicon Z, if you don't use plasma treatment, the lens material will not wet. It requires that to actually get the lens to wet.
Okay, and I believe this is our final question, Paul. How often do you recommend replacing the fitting set? Because we have a lot of fitting sets out there across the world, and we do get questions about how to care for these fitting sets. But this one specifically is, do you recommend replacing the fitting set, or how often?
Okay, firstly, dealing with the rigid fitting sets, Jennifer, it depends how they are used and how they're treated, obviously, so that can be variable. But I go out there and I'm seeing practice. I was in a practice in Auckland just the other day. His set is 20 years old and he's still using it. We made them in PMMA in those days, so the material was very stable, but I certainly wouldn't advocate that. What I would advocate is getting a laboratory to check them at least every 5 years. Just send your set to the laboratory and ask them to check the parameters, because it's a bit difficult for you to do. They can look if the power is correct, and often you'll find it comes back with a slightly different label, power or base curve. They may not necessarily remake the lens, they'll just relabel it with what the parameters are. So you can expect to get some change over time. The best person to sort that out from is your laboratory. With soft set lenses, they should be replaced every 2 years. Soft trial lenses do warp after time, so I recommend every 2 years they should be replaced.
Perfect. Okay. Ooh, yay, we made it, Paul.
Excellent. It's a good timing, Jennifer.
Great. Guys, I know we are almost short on, actually we are past time, and I apologize because we were hoping to get more questions. I know there have been questions that have come through. Dr. Flores, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here. We are over
okay, great.
time, but we have many questions from the audience, but maybe we can choose one, and maybe Paul can answer for the rest of the question for email. So I have a question from Christopher Tan, very proactive ECP. Thank you for your question. And he asks about, what are the causes that make it difficult to remove a semi-scleral lenses like Rose KXL, Paul?
The most common one is a very, very steep, where the lens is extremely steep, both in the center and in the periphery. So the most common reason that I see is not having a periphery edge lift which is high enough and leaving the base curve too steep. We talked about movement and the base curve, and if you steepen the base curve, you get more movement. That is only to a certain point, usually 0.2, 0.3 outside the optimum base curve that you are fitting. Once you get very steep, like 0.6 or 0.8 steep, the lens can create large suction forces and be very difficult to remove. So first thing, look at your edge lift. See if you can open your edge lift up a bit more, Patricia. That's my first thing I look at. And then look at, is the base curve very steep? Can I go a bit flatter with my base curve? If it's difficult to remove, it can sometimes help as well.
Excellent.
Great. It looks like we are out of time. I do see that there are quite a few questions, so apologies we couldn't get to more of them. We will be repeating this session actually in a couple days tomorrow. but more for the European market. So we actually might look at those questions and see if we can include any for the next session. But regardless, I do want to say a big thank you to Paul for doing this session. I know it's the end of the year and you've done a ton of webinars for us. So thank you so much for taking the time to answer these questions for all of our practitioners out there. So thank you, Paul.
You're welcome, Jennifer.
Also to Dr. Flores, thank you, Patricia, for making sure everything runs smoothly once again and for fielding all the questions. So very much appreciate you in your abilities to make sure this goes smoothly. And then, of course, thank you to all of you. For those of you who've joined us throughout this entire year, thank you. We really appreciate having you guys here and your curiosity and your willingness to learn. So that's the key. And also your questions. So this was a Q&A session. We will send you some surveys to ask you with regards to what you thought about it and whether you want more of these or not. Hopefully you were able to take a few nuggets and pearls away from this particular lecture, and it will help you with your Rose K fits going forward. So on that note, everybody, thank you once again. I know we've gone a little bit over time, but I know we won't touch base with you guys until the new year. So in the meantime, happy holidays. Stay safe because coronavirus is still out there. Stay healthy, and we will see you guys again in 2021. We will send you guys notices with regards to what our schedule will be, but we definitely will have more webinars in the new year. So once again, my name is Jennifer Chu, and it is always a pleasure to host you guys. So thank you all again, and we'll see you guys next time.
Bye-bye,
Bye.
everybody.